I don't think it can be avoided, and I don't think it should be avoided. Let me step back and provide some context here. We're 2 centuries into the Industrial Revolution. And as we enter the 3rd century, we find ourselves in a very, very challenging situation. First of all, let's take a look at how we've all benefited from the last 200 years of industrial-based capitalism. Arguably, half the human race today are far better off than our ancestors were before we began the industrial way of life, granted. I think also it's fair to say that 45% of the human race today, making $5 a day or less, are no better off and maybe worse off than their ancestors were before we began the industrial age. And while half the human race has done much better, the other half of the human race not really better at all, probably worse, the very wealthy have done very well. The 8 richest people in the world today, 8 individuals today, their combined wealth now equals the accumulated wealth of 1/2 the human beings living on Earth. That's 3.5 billion people. So this is kind of the framework, the economic framework for the last 2 centuries of an industrial revolution. But now we have a more serious crisis. The Industrial Revolution is built off a fossil fuel civilization. About 200 years ago, our ancestors decided to dig down and into the burial grounds of a previous geological period of history, and they exhumed the dead bodies. Those dead bodies had turned into oil, coal, and gas. They were plant and animal life. And they took those fossil fuels, extracted them, and built an entire civilization on them. The industrial age is about fossil fuels. Our fertilizers, our pesticides, our construction materials, our pharmaceutical products, our preservatives and additives for our food, our power, our transport, our heat, our light, our packaging, it's endless. It's endless. And what's happened now, this industrial age built on fossil fuels, is now taken us to real-time climate change. By exhuming all of this carbon-based former life from a previous period of history, we burned it, and massive amounts of global warming gases from carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide went into the atmosphere. And so they're blocking the sun's heat from getting back off the earth. That's where we're at. And let me explain what this is all about, climate change. If it's explained, everyone in the world would be not only terrified, but on mission to save our species and our fellow creatures and the planet we live in. Climate change changes the water cycles of the earth. That's what this is all about. We're the watery planet. No water, no life. Our ecosystems have developed over millions of years based on the hydrological cycle, the water cycle that travels through the clouds and bathes our biomes and ecosystems and lets life flourish. Here's the problem we're facing. For every 1 degree Celsius the temperature goes up on the planet because of global warming emissions, the atmosphere is sucking up 7% more precipitation from the ground. The heat is forcing precipitation into the clouds, and we're getting more concentrated precipitation in the clouds and wild, unpredictable water events. I'll just use North America, my continent, as an example. In Europe and elsewhere around the world, you have similar examples. Last winter, we had 80 and 90 below zero temperatures in the polar vortex and massive snows. And when the winter is over, the water events turn to floods. And in the spring each year, our entire midsection of the United States, the Mississippi River and Missouri rivers, totally flooded across the entire mid part of the country for months at a time. So bad last year that our federal government had to bail out the farmers because the agricultural crops did not come in. We have small towns evacuating forever. They're turning into ghost towns because there's no flood insurance and people are doubling up with their neighbors in other parts of the country. Then after the spring floods, we get the summer droughts and wildfires. As I speak to you, in the last several weeks, California was on fire. It's been on fire for months at a time. And a few weeks ago, we had to shut down the entire electricity grid of Northern California, the 5th largest economy in the world, for fear the entire state would burn up from drought and wildfires. Then when the wildfire season's over and the drought, we hit the hurricane season in August to December. We had 5 massive hurricanes hit the eastern part of the country in the Gulf areas in just 5 weeks. This is happening all over the world. Our ecosystems cannot catch up to this runaway water cycle, and they're collapsing. They can't evolve fast enough to adjust to this. They're collapsing. Loss of life, loss of property. Our scientists are now telling us we are in the 6th extinction of life on Earth because of the fossil fuel civilization. And I want to step back again for a moment to understand what this means. We've had 5 mass extinctions of life on this Earth in 450 million years, way before humans were here. We're the youngest species as far as we know. We're the babies. Anatomically modern humans, we've been here about 200,000 years. But in these previous periods of history, when a mass extinction happened, it happened quick, and then it took 10 million years to get new life back. We're now in the 6th extinction. I want every young Gen Z and millennial and parent and grandparent to hear this. Our scientists tell us this fossil fuel civilization has taken us to the point where we may lose half the species of life inhabiting this planet in the next 8 decades. We'll never see them again, we'll never hear them again, and they've been here for millions of years. This is in the lifetime of toddlers today who will be my age in 8 decades from now. The last time we had an extinction on this magnitude was 65 million years ago, and it took place over thousands of years. So we're asleep. But what's happened is a younger generation is now awakening because it's on their watch. The Gen Zs, high school students, the millennials who are now in the workforce, 3 times in the last year they went on strike. They went out of the schools, they went out of their offices, they went onto the streets, millions of them in 130 countries. And they declared a global climate emergency on fossil fuels, and they called for a global Green New Deal. And we need to really understand what this is about. This is not like any protest in history. We've had all sorts of protests in history. Human beings like to protest. This is of a different ilk. This is the first planetary revolt of the human race. This is the first time an entire generation across all of the borders, the boundaries that divide people have come together and seen themselves as a species and imperiled and perceive of their fellow creatures as part of their evolutionary family imperiled. And this is the first time young people are seeing and experiencing the biosphere as their indivisible community. They're eliminating the other. This is hugely important. So this gives me hope. Now, how does this dovetail with the collapse of the fossil fuel civilization? It's very interesting. This is good news, actually, with a quotes, if we can make a shift into a new economic era quick enough, all right, to allow life to flourish in a new way. Fossil fuels have been collapsing because solar and wind electricity are now becoming more dominant. Let me explain. Solar and wind electricity have been on a falling exponential cost curve for many, many years now, just like computers. So people can put this in context. With computers, when I was a kid, I'm a World War II baby, we didn't have computers. The first computer was the UNIVAC at my university, University of Pennsylvania. And at the time, in the 1940s, the chairman of IBM predicted we would need 5 to 7 computers for the world. That's it. Everybody laughs under 40. What we didn't anticipate is engineers at Intel and other companies started to double the capacity on chips every 2 years. Now we have smartphones in China and Korea for $25 with more computing power than sent our astronauts to the moon. There are literally people in the Amazon, in the palm of their hand, have more power than sent our astronauts to the moon. What's happened with solar and wind is the same exponential curve. Exponential curves are very strange because you don't notice them until it's over. So if I give you $1 and double it every day, $1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 250, 6, 5, 12, big deal. Once it gets into the 20s, though, when you start doubling in the 20s, it goes through the roof. So a fixed watt of solar energy cost $78 in the 1970s. Today, it's not $78, it's 43 cents, 35 cents in 18 months from now. And what's interesting is we have now power and utility companies in the last 18 months, quietly, in Europe, America, and elsewhere, buying long-term contracts for solar and wind at 5 cents, 4 cents, 3 cents, 2.5 cents kilowatt hour, because they know the exponential curves in the falling price. What this means is this year, and every bank in the world should understand this, and every financial institution, This year, the levelized cost of solar and wind, utility scale, just dipped below the cost of natural gas. Way below nuclear, they're gone. Way below coal, way below oil, and it's now the cheapest energy below natural gas. And what this signals is the beginning of the collapse of the fossil fuel civilization. There are three major sectors that make up infrastructure revolutions. Every infrastructure revolution in history, there's only been 7 or 8 big ones. They change the course of civilization. And they all share a common denominator, and that is at a moment of time, 3 defining technologies can emerge and converge across a civilization to create an infrastructure that changes the way we manage power and move our day-to-day life. And here's what the revolutions are. First, communication revolutions. That allows us to bring larger collectivities together in more complex relationships over time and space to manage economy and social life and governance, communication revolutions. Secondly, new sources of energy. Again, that allows us to bring larger collectivities together in more complex ways to engage in economic and social life and governance because they have the energy to do it. And third is mobility. Again, mobility revolutions, again, annihilate time and space, bring larger collectivities together, very complex activities to maintain day-to-day economic life and social life. So when communication revolutions converge with new energy regimes and new mobility and logistics, it changes the way society manages, powers, and moves its activity and allows us to be a larger social unit. It changes our habitats. It also changes our business models and our governance. And if all of this sounds familiar and it's not in any textbook, if you took high school biology, you should be smiling right now because every cell in every organism has to have a means to communicate. Every cell in every organism has to have a source of energy to survive. And every cell in every organism has to have a means of motility and mobility, movement. And every cell in every organism has to have a habitat. It's called its semi-permeable membrane, its skin or its shell, to orchestrate its internal rhythms with the outside world. Our infrastructures in history are a prosthesis that extends an organism so the whole social grouping of people can engage as one social organism. So it's not in any textbooks, but that's the anthropology of how we've developed. So how does it fit this collapse of the fossil fuel civilization? 200 years ago, we created the first industrial revolution. The communication revolution was in Britain, and in Great Britain at that time, they invented steam power printing. No more manual print presses. With steam power printing, you could have a lot of cheap production of print. So you could have something called textbooks for universal public education, or else we could never have financed it. And newspapers, magazines, catalogs, etc. And then the Brits laid out a telegraph system, all right? Steam power printing and the telegraph then converged with a new source of energy, coal, the beginning of the fossil fuel civilization, harvested by the same steam engine. Then they put the steam engine on rails, using that coal to burn the energy, and we had national railroads in Britain. The coming together of that communication, energy, mobility infrastructure changed our semi-permeable membranes, our habitats, and people started to congregate in dense urban areas because of hub-to-hub rail traffic. And that infrastructure gave rise to national markets because you could bring more people together over time and space. National markets gave us nation-state governance. Infrastructures, economic models don't create infrastructures. Infrastructures create the framework for the kind of economic models that might actually manage them. And governments don't create infrastructures. The infrastructures provide the framework for the kind of oversight a government needs to manage life. Not rocket science, not in any textbooks. So then there was the second industrial revolution, again fossil fuels, this time the United States. In this case, the telephone is a really big deal. I know everyone thinks the internet's a big deal. You could conceive of an internet before it happened. Nobody could conceive of the telephone. It came out of nowhere. All of a sudden, people virtually talking through a machine and someone's talking back to them 1,000 miles away. Later, radio and television. In the US, those communication revolutions converged with a new source of fossil fuels, cheap Texas oil. Then Henry Ford put everyone in new mobility, the internal combustion engine. That led us to the suburbs, new housing environments, new semi-permeable membrane, suburban build-outs, travel and tourism, shopping malls, and the whole works. That second industrial revolution took us through the 20th century all over the world. It peaked. The fossil fuel civilization and the industrial age built on it peaked in July 2008. If you remember that month, Brent crude oil hit $147 a barrel. That was a record. The entire global economy went silent. That was the great economic earthquake of the fossil fuel civilization. The collapse of the financial market 60 days later, that was the aftershock. That was simply a subprime Ponzi scheme. It was a fictional economy. So what we're having now is that we're at the beginning of a long, torturous, convulsive endgame for fossil fuel civilization. The oil industry is fighting with the fracking and gas industries, fighting with the coal industry. But I don't think anyone listening to me believes we're in the sunrise of the fossil fuel civilization. And and the problem is whenever those prices gyrate over 80 a barrel, all the other prices go up because everything's made out of fossil fuels. And wherever we have fossil fuels, we have failed states and authoritarian states, with the exception of two outliers. The United States, unfortunately, the #1 producer of fossil fuels in the world. #4, Canada. What's happened now is because in 2019, the levelized cost of solar and wind have now dipped below all the other energies, there's panic. And I work with industries around the world and electric utilities, and what they're seeing is that because the marketplace is speaking and solar and wind are now cheaper, now batteries to store them are now cheaper, it means that trillions of dollars are now in stranded assets across the entire fossil fuel civilization. Citigroup, the great bank, they were the first to get this. They had a glimmer of this about 5 years ago. They saw this coming. And they said, we may be sitting on $100 trillion of stranded assets in the fossil fuel industry. It's the biggest bubble in history, the carbon bubble. That means all the exploration rights that have been purchased, we'll never amortize them out over 30 years. Solar and wind are cheaper and they're plunging their cost down. It means all of the fossil fuels in the ground or under the ocean floor, we'll never use them. Too expensive. It's all the pipelines, gas and pipelines we put in, and oil pipelines, we'll never use them or amortize them. It's all the refineries to refine the chemicals, we'll never use them. And it's all the industries tied to that complex. So already in 4 years, $11 trillion have flooded out of the fossil fuel complex. And they're being led, interesting enough, by public pension funds. Very interesting what's happening. Karl Marx would have been flipping in his grave about what I'm about to say. He would have never understood this. The workers of the world are the capitalists. It's the best kept secret of capitalism. Nobody really wants to talk about it upstairs, if you will. But it turns out that hundreds of millions of working people have their deferred savings invested on their behalf in pension funds for their retirement. It's $41 trillion. It's the largest pool of capital in the world. It's just everyone that's part of that doesn't realize that they are the actual major capitalist class. What happened in the last few years, though, is the public pension funds and private pension funds and other insurance funds, they began to see what happened to the coal industry in America. They went bankrupt because natural gas was cheaper, and then solar and wind became cheaper than natural gas. And when they went bankrupt, all the workers lost their pensions. All right? Right now in France, there's a whole strike going on around pension reform. This is no small thing. This is the deferred savings of millions of people. What's happened now is public pension funds, the big cities, New York, London, all over the world, they've gotten out. They don't want their public employees to be stranded with no money. It's their money for their retirement. Now the private pension funds, the insurance funds, the mutual funds, the family funds, they're flooding out. So we're seeing the collapse of the fossil fuel civilization. Let me just give it a more granular look here. The three major sectors that make up this third industrial revolution: infrastructure, ICT, telecom, communication, fossil fuel, nuclear power, energy, internal combustion, road, rail, water, and air transport for mobility that make up the second industrial revolution infrastructure. All three are decoupling from fossil fuels. First of all, ICT, telecom. All the major internet companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon, they're already totally off fossil fuels. Their data centers are either totally 100% renewables because they can secure them and they're cheaper, or they're buying certificates to produce solar and wind somewhere else. But Intel, Cisco, Microsoft, they've all said they'll be almost totally off and completely off by 2021 and 22. They're getting out. It's cheaper, and it's more secure, and it's clean, and it doesn't take us to extinction. Now the utilities, electric utilities, which are energy, are getting out. And what happened here is very, very interesting. I worked with Germany, with the Chancellor and Merkel and the German leadership. We had 4 major power companies in Germany, EnBW, RWE, E.ON, and Vattenfall. These big, giant, vertically integrated companies, we thought they're invincible. They got totally wiped out. Because what happened is they didn't understand the nature of infrastructure disruptions. The great disruptions in history is where you shift an infrastructure. For example, if you go from oral culture to script, that's a huge shift in history, right? Or from script, if you will, to the telegraph, that's a big deal. Or if you go from horses to carry you to locomotives, that's a big deal. So the infrastructure disruptions are significant. What happened in the power and electricity industry in Germany, they didn't understand how disruptions work. So when solar and wind was only 4% of the electricity, 96% fossil fuel nuclear, who cares? What they didn't realize is it's not so important how powerful the incumbent is in a market, it's how fast the challenger's moving into that market. So when electricity took on gas lighting, when electricity got to 3% of the market, investment shifted because it was moving too quick. They saw that the gas lighting was over. What we saw in Germany is when solar and wind were only 14% of the electricity, that was the inflection point, and that they lost billions, hundreds of billions of dollars across Europe in the power industry. 14% is the inflection point. When the investment says it's over, we know why should we stay in fossil fuels when solar and wind is cheaper and they're moving quicker into the market. The U.S. reaches 14% solar and wind electricity in its electricity in 2023. The whole world reaches 14% solar and wind electricity in 2028. Now, the third sector is mobility. Remember, communications getting out. Now, electricity and utilities are getting out. Now, transport. What's interesting is only 2.5% of global sales are electric vehicles now, annually. That's all it is. But the studies internal to the industry, in transport industry, show that we will have electric vehicles competitive without subsidies to internal combustion vehicles in 2023. By 2026, they'll be cheaper. And by 2028, 20% of the vehicles in the world will be electric vehicles. And that's the inflection point, just like we saw electricity or ICT. Why is that important? We consume 93, 94 million barrels of oil a day in the world. 2/3 of it goes to transport. These are going to be electric vehicles powered by solar and wind. They're going to be autonomous vehicles on smart road, rail, and water and air systems, all right? Now, to show you that this is not just a bunch of studies, and let me say everything I'm saying to you, none of this is projection or daydreaming. In the book, The Green New Deal, which we just published, we have studies in the last 18 months from across the insurance industry, the banking industry, all of the major sectors, transport, logistics, mobility, real estate. These are internal studies showing this is happening. To show you how serious it is in transport, Volkswagen, they're the largest producer of vehicles in the world. They've just announced they're putting out the last internal combustion platform for vehicles in 2026. It's over. And they're now saying that they're going to put 80 billion euros, that's a lot of money for one company, into a complete transformation in electric vehicles. And by 2028, they're going to produce 22 million vehicles a year, 1/4 of global production, to stay in line with Toyota. Toyota is moving to electric as well, and fuel cell vehicles. What we have here is a major collapse. The problem is trillions of dollars are getting out of fossil fuel complex because solar and wind are cheaper and the market is speaking. But now they desperately want to invest in a new third industrial revolution, a smart transformation to a completely new infrastructure, but we don't have the scaled projects because governments have to create the infrastructure. The market can create the opportunities, but they don't create interstate highway systems or public school systems or any of that. So the collapse means we may be able to move forward, but now we have to discuss what's the next industrial revolution. that can take us out of fossil fuels to a post-carbon era.